Decoding Antisemitism on Social Media, Kanye, Qatar and the Promise of AI. A stellar lineup to discuss the specific nature of online communication and how it has increased anti-Semitism in the world generally and specifically online. The Centre for Research on Anti-Semitism in Berlin has collaborated with HTW, also in Berlin, Hate Lab in Cardiff and King's College London to undertake a research project which analyses the frequency, content and linguistic structure of anti-Semitism on social media and below the line in the comment sections of the mainstream media in the UK, France and Germany. In this LCSCA event, members of the project present their findings from the latest discourse report, which assessed the anti-Semitic reactions triggered by recent news stories, including Kanye West's tweets and statements, and anti-Israel incidents at the 2022 World Cup in Qatar. The participants are Dr. Lev Toper from the Centre for Cyber Law and Policy at Haifa University. He moderates. Dr. Matthew Bolton, a researcher, lecturer and writer focusing on conceptual history, critical theory, legal theory and anti-Semitism. Professor Helen Mahaljevich, who holds a chair in data science at the Berlin University of Applied Sciences, and Karolina Placenta, who is a linguist and political scientist with an interest in pragmatics, sociolinguistics, and critical discourse analysis.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to start us off with a kind of general introduction to the project, the rationale behind the project, the problem that the Decoding Antisemitism is struggling with, some of the ways in which we deal with that problem, and showing you basically how we work on a day-to-day basis before handing over to Carolina to talk about some of the results in the latest discourse report that we've published. Okay, so decoding anti-Semitism. What is it that we do on a day-to-day basis? Basically, we spend a lot of time monitoring what's going on in the news, what's being published in mainstream media outlets, and what's being discussed on social media in three language communities: English, focusing particularly on the UK, France, and Germany. And what we're looking for are particular news stories that we think might trigger, to use the term we use, trigger discussions or discourses online that might be susceptible to having anti-Semitic comments or statements as part of that discussion. Once we've identified a discourse trigger, we then use a special tool which is able to kind of download comment threads from various social media platforms or from newspaper websites where people are kind of discussing what's going on, and then we try and analyze those threads using different approaches drawn from various disciplines: humanities, like linguistics, conceptual history, social sciences, and then data science. The overarching aims of the project are to try and really understand what is out there in terms of anti-Semitic discourse online. We think that there are many ways in which we can approach that. We think we've got a particular method which is able to identify certain forms of anti-Semitic statements, which other methods may struggle to kind of pick out. And by doing that, we can get a much better kind of picture of the actual state of play in terms of how much anti-Semitic discourse and discussion there is online. Once we've established that picture, a much more accurate picture, we think, of what's going on, that will be able to feed into much more effective prevention and counter strategies in terms of dealing with anti-Semitism online. Primarily in the kind of academic research community for other researchers who are working on this, but also there's a much wider potential usage for it in politics, media, security services, social media companies, all of this kind of stuff. All of these organizations we think will have some use for some of our research. Another aim is to contribute to improving AI models, their ability to detect anti-Semitism online. I'm sure we've, all had experiences of noticing anti-Semitism on the comments which are just not recognized. We might report them to social media companies, and the social media companies just don't understand the ways in which they're anti-Semitic, and AI models in particular can struggle picking out some forms of anti-Semitism because it's such a complex, ever-shifting ideology. We're currently working on plans for a future project, a follow-up project, basically expanding the project as it stands to bring in the US, thinking about discourses in the US and the interrelation of discourses in the US with discussions in Europe, because obviously, the US has quite an outsized impact on social media, certainly, and so we're trying to expand the project to bring in analysis of what's going on in US centric social media. Another part of the follow-up project will be thinking about generative AI. Lots of people have been talking about this recently. AI, which is capable of creating text and creating images of its own accord, essentially, and what are the implications of that for anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic discourse online, and how that affects ways in which we can kind of grapple with it or challenge it. Okay, so just to paint a general picture, as I'm sure we're all aware, the internet over the past 10, 15, 20 years has increasingly become the place to go for public discussion, political discussion, exchanging ideas, exchanging opinions, having arguments, and of course, it's become the major forum for the spread of all sorts of ideas, but anti-Semitic ideas and concepts as well. And studying internet studies, the study of the internet it provides a particular challenge. It needs a particular approach to studying how communication works online, which is not the same as how communication works offline. There are overlaps, but there's a very distinct way in which discussions online have developed over the past 10, 15 years. You have different communicative dynamics and different communicative conditions, such as lots of anonymity. People can basically, hide their identities, which perhaps gives people more confidence to say racist and anti-Semitic things and abusive things. You have lots of mutual reinforcement, where someone might feel more confident to say something anti-Semitic that they might not otherwise, when they know they have perhaps another 100 anonymous accounts who are going to back them up. Or there's the creation of kind of echo chambers or filter bubbles, where certain ideas kind of spread and get intensified through being repeated and bounced back and forth. There's pretty much a lack, compared with the kind of regulation that you get of mainstream media about what can and cannot be published. There's a distinct lack of that online, especially on social media. Social media companies and governments are kind of behind, a long way behind the development. They're trying to catch up in terms of trying to regulate it, but they're struggling. And all of this means that there are shifting boundaries of what people feel able to say in public. People are willing to say things online that you would imagine they probably wouldn't say face to face with someone, or if their name was attached to it. So that presents a certain problem, and there are different methods in which communication online can be studied. And one kind of strand of thought goes for kind of quantitative analysis, which is essentially big numbers, right? So it's like you might, for example, you might go through, search millions of tweets or thousands and thousands of posts on Facebook or something, looking for certain words, the frequency of certain words. And in terms of anti-Semitism, you might look for, words like Jew or other related words, and or abusive words, words that are associated, that are used to kind of abuse Jewish people or abuse Israel, for example. And you might search for those words, and then from that you can build a model of how many times these words appear in social media discourse. Now, the advantages of doing these kind of big scale quantitative studies is that they can be quite representative, because you're using so much data, you're getting a kind of good broad coverage across the whole of the internet, really, or the whole of the site itself. The problem comes when you're trying to do much smaller scale analysis, and some of the meanings some of the ways in which people might use language online are just not picked up when you're just searching for certain terms, because you can use the same term in like Jewish, for example. You can use the same term in a positive sense, you can use it in a neutral sense, and you can use it in a negative or abusive sense, and you don't pick up that kind of contextualized meaning if you're just flagging up how many times a certain word is used. Even a word that you might consider extremely anti-Semitic could be used in a comment online in order to counter, or sarcastically countering someone else who is being anti-Semitic. And so there's a danger that you can create false positives by labeling every tweet or every comment which uses a certain word as anti-Semitic, when actually that might not be the case at all. Our approach is slightly different. We go for a kind of qualitative analysis. Now, what we try and do here is that we try and get real world, authentic data from the web, real life Twitter discussions or Facebook discussions or discussions on newspaper websites that people have written themselves. So it's not like a survey where, you might have a survey about whether people believe certain conspiracy theories about Jews and they give the answers. The problem with those kind of surveys is that people are often primed by the question. The question might be framed in a certain way that kind of leads to a certain answer, or there might be the person who's being asked the question might be fully aware that actually they couldn't really say what they actually thought, because there's a kind of social sanction against saying something anti-Semitic in an interview situation or whatever. Online, people are often more likely, especially if they're anonymous, to kind of just write what they think. So we can capture that data, and then we can analyze it closely. We have a team of researchers who go through these threads and try and really analyze each comment to try and grasp what is the meaning of this comment, what is actually being said. And we try and analyze it at the level of the ideas that are being expressed, but also the kind of language, the linguistic structure that is being used. And there are all sorts of different linguistic structures which can be used in a comment, which can, depending on the content, change the meaning. So qualitative analysis allows you to recognize the different ways in which certain terms can be used to produce different meanings. The problem with this kind of analysis is that it's very labor intensive. It takes a long time. Often we have these huge arguments with 3 or 4 of us looking at a single comment, trying to work out what is the actual meaning of this, what are they actually saying. And you have to take into account the context, the overall context of the news story itself. You have to take into account the context of the thread, what's previously been said. And all of these things can take up time. So it's very labor intensive, which means that you can only do, a few thousand comments. I mean, we've done quite a few, but compared with a quantitative approach where you can look at millions of tweets, it's much harder to kind of get huge numbers. So that means that the results cannot on their own be classed as socially representative, which is why you need to bring qualitative and quantitative methods together, which is one of the aims of the project. Okay, so some of the implicit or coded meanings that you find in comments, which in anti-Semitic comments, which we think might not be picked up by other approaches. Then there's all sorts. So there are things like you might find puns like Schwindler's List or Zio-Nazis, Israel comes up all the time. Another one we picked up recently is Isn't Real, which was a new one. Satan Yahoo, which is a play on Netanyahu's name, and Soros spelt with snakes. These kind of statements or terms in comments are obviously extremely anti-Semitic, but they can only really be picked out by qualitative analysis. You have to, it's very difficult for a kind of, especially automated detection to pick up on this kind of thing unless it's been qualitatively analyzed first. Other forms of implicit meaning, you get allusions, references to, East Coast bankers or the lobby, or terms like globalist or NWO, both of which are actually quite interesting in this context, because you could use, not every single person who tweets or writes a comment which includes the term globalist or NWO, that doesn't on its own make a comment anti-Semitic. So if you can't just flag up every time someone says globalist and say this comment is anti-Semitic. That comment needs to be analyzed. You need to see what other words are surrounding terms like globalist or NWO to understand whether this actually is being used in an anti-Semitic way. So again, you need qualitative analysis to be able to do that. Another very common thing we find is implicit Nazi comparisons between Jews and the Nazis, or between Israel and the Nazis, often using allusions. So notions that the final solution of the Palestinian question, or the Fourth Reich, that Israel is the Fourth Reich rising, and you don't, the allusion is not being made directly there. It's not as easy as saying, Israel is like the Nazis, or Israel is like Nazi Germany, or whatever. It's being made in a kind of implicit, elusive way, which again needs qualitative analysis to pick up. You also get indirect speech acts, things like who owns the British media. Again, on its own, that might not be anti-Semitic in certain contexts. If you take the context of the thread or the news story or whatever, it very well could be. And of course, there's no mention of, it's a rhetorical question. There's no mention of Jews. There's no mention of, anything to do with Jews at all here. But in certain contexts, that could be a deeply anti-Semitic statement. And again, it needs to be qualitatively analysed before you can pick up on that anti-Semitic meaning. And then, of course, there are semiotic markers and 3 brackets, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with. Again, that's an interesting one, because that arose in kind of far-right internet forums as a means of kind of, identifying people as Jewish without actually saying this person is a Jew. So it was like a kind of in joke, or a little secret message for the community of those forums. It then spread on social media, and then it gets adopted as a kind of counter strategy by people who are seeking to push back against anti-Semitism online. And you see lots of people putting brackets around their own name as a kind of show of solidarity, and as a way of kind of destroying that kind of internal group in-joke that had been developed on the far right. So you cannot flag every comment which has 3 brackets and say this is anti-Semitic, because it could very well be used in a way that's trying to counter anti-Semitism. And then, of course, the icons and emojis, which can be used in an anti-Semitic way depending on the context, and memes. One very prominent one being the Happy Merchant meme. And I think the Happy Merchant meme, just to look at this briefly, is quite interesting, because you can see how much it changes over time, how much these kind of ideas develop, how much anti-Semitic ideas are able to shapeshift according to different news stories, according to what's going on in the world. So we have one on the left, which is a kind of, the idea that, Jews are in control of everything, basically in control of everything from Hollywood to the banking industry, to the media, to, pornography, everything. And then we see again the same image being used as a kind of, COVID conspiracy, anti-vax kind of thing. The idea that Jews are somehow behind this kind of conspiratorial vaccine campaign. And then again, you see the same image being adapted to the situation in Ukraine, with Zelensky being kind of portrayed in that same way. So you can see how these things are constantly evolving, and they need qualitative analysis to continual qualitative analysis to be able to recognize all of these things as anti-Semitic. Okay, just very briefly to talk about, how we actually analyze the comments. There's a kind of three-step methodology. Qualitative content analysis, followed by supervised machine learning approaches, which is what Helena will be talking about, and then quantitative analysis. So qualitative content analysis. So far, we've analysed around 80,000 online comments. It's probably more than that now. We're trying to push it as many as we can. And in order to analyse those comments, we use a program called MaxQDA. And MaxQDA relies on what's called a code system. And together with the rest of the team, we have kind of put together a code system which essentially is a list of, I don't know, I think it's about 45 different anti-Semitic concepts or stereotypes or ideas. And they range from kind of classic or canonical anti-Semitic concepts, the idea of Jewish greed or Jewish evil or Jewish immorality, ideas of, Jewish power, Jewish control, and then more kind of post-1945 anti-Semitic concepts around, the Holocaust denial, some German-specific concepts to do with the kind of rejection of German guilt and ideas that Jews are to blame for the Holocaust in some way. And then we have Israel, a set of Israel-related anti-Semitic concepts. And we use this code system, and I should note that this code system, we're currently working on turning it into a book, a kind of lexicon of anti-Semitic concepts, which will basically act as a reference guide for anybody who, you might find a comment online and you're convinced that it's anti-Semitic in some way. This book will hopefully allow you to find out exactly what concept is being expressed, and be able to kind of show why it's anti-Semitic. And we're using a lot of examples, real life examples from the work of the project, and that should be being published early next year, I think. So when we analyze each comment, we try and analyze it on the conceptual level. What is the anti-Semitic comment content? What concept is being expressed in the comment? Is it about Jewish greed? Is it about Jewish evil? And we also look at it on the linguistic level. What are the linguistic kind of forms or structures that are being used to express the concept that we've identified? And obviously that's very easy if it's, Jewish people are very greedy, right? That's a very simple statement, but often, as we've already seen, there are lots of kind of implicit and quite complex meanings to try and unpick. So we have to analyze it at that level as well. And this is what the program looks like. So you can see on the left-hand side, you have the big list of all the different stereotypes and concepts that we use. And then on the right-hand side, this is a little portion of a Facebook thread, I think. And you can see the way in which we try and kind of essentially label. We label whether we think it's anti-Semitic or not. We label whether we think it's anti-Semitic in a way that you can pick up immediately. So if the comment was printed on a t-shirt and you saw it, you were walking around somewhere and you saw someone wearing that comment on a t-shirt, you could say that's anti-Semitic. Or is it a comment that the anti-Semitism is only understandable or graspable in the context of the thread? So we have two different ways of doing it. Is it directly anti-Semitic? Is it contextually anti-Semitic? And then we label it in terms of the concepts that are being expressed and the linguistic structure. Is there a rhetorical question? Is there irony, sarcasm? Are emojis being used? Is there imagery? Is there an allusion? That kind of thing. And so we end up with these threads that are coded, analyzed in this way. And we've done, as I say, we've done 90,000 comments analyzed like that. Once we've got that, we've got all the data from online, it's all been kind of analyzed. We then pass that over to the data science team who are working on machine learning approaches. And the idea is that they're able, or they're trying to train the AI to essentially make the same decisions that the expert coders of the team make themselves when we read the comment, right? So can we get the AI to take into account the broader context of the thread, elements of meaning which you need to grasp from a broader knowledge of what's going on than you can't just get from the text itself. Can we get the AI to be able to distinguish a comment that's using a term neutrally or as a means of countering anti-Semitism? Can we get the AI to distinguish that from an anti-Semitic statement? And so that's the task of, that's what we're trying to do with the AI element, because that will allow far more anti-Semitic content to be picked up, to be identified, and hopefully to be kind of pushed back against. The third step is that once, if the AI can start picking up some of this more implicit anti-Semitism, then we can then use that to make quite huge quantitative analysis by using, by applying the algorithm to huge amounts of data. We can start picking up patterns, how often, certain words or combinations of words come together. And then hopefully we can get a much more concrete understanding of what's out there. Okay, and there's a kind of image which shows how it works. So at the top you have the raw data, which is the online threads. They are then put into step one, which is a quantitative analysis using this code system, the guidebook as we call it, which is the thing that's going to be published. We then annotate the data. That data is then fed back into the kind of AI program, the supervised machine learning. They can come up with models. They can then test them on the data that's already been analyzed, and we can see whether it's able to make the same decisions as the coders would. Once that's been done, that then moves to step three. And quantitative analysis, and we're able to build statistical models, and then you can start feeding raw data into the AI, data that hasn't been coded, to see whether the AI is able to pick up the anti-Semitism there, and then you need to test that against expert coders again. So it's a continual cycle, moving from qualitative analysis done by experts to the AI, to the AI testing the AI, that's then checked by the experts, and it goes on and on and on. And you have to do it like that because of the way that online speech and online anti-Semitic speech is in continual development. If you stopped at a certain point and said, okay, that's enough, we're not going to analyze anymore, in a year's time, you try to use an AI that would been built on social media discussions from 2 years previously, I don't think it would pick it up, because it would lose a lot of the anti-Semitic comments, because language has changed, the in-jokes have changed, the memes have changed. So you need a continual kind of process of qualitative analysis feeding into the AI, and a continual development of the AI. And yes, so we publish regular 6-monthly reports where we talk about certain discourse triggers that we've analyzed, and the results that we found. We're on the 5th one now. The previous one, I think, was looking at anti-Semitism in terms of discussions around the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we've done lots of different things. We've looked at, Corbyn stuff. We've looked at individual cases such as the David Miller case, Bristol University professor. We've looked at kind of COVID-19, the vaccine rollout in Israel. All of these things we've kind of analysed to pick up the different forms of anti-Semitic speech that appear there. And now I'm going to hand over to Carolina, who's going to introduce, kind of talk you through some of the results from the 5th discourse report that we published a couple of months ago.
Thanks, Matt. So as Matt already said, in each of the reports, we tried to capture recent events and reactions to those recent events in comment sections. And the one published most recently in April focuses on 3 such events. The first one is reactions in comment sections to the media reports around Kanye West's anti-Semitic statements, and we analyzed that for the UK media and French media. We then looked at reactions to anti-Semitic incidents at the Football World Cup in Qatar last year, and we analyzed that for the UK. And we also looked at responses to Israeli elections in November in Germany, in German discourse. And all of the 3 sort of happened in the autumn of last year, so fairly recently. In total, for that report, we analyzed over 7,300 online comments. And crucially, this report also contains a chapter on evaluation of existing tools for the automatic detection of hate speech, which Helena will talk about in a few minutes. But before that, we'd like to talk about 2 of the events to give you an idea of that qualitative analysis that Matt was talking about earlier with some examples. So on the next slide, we've got some information about the first of them, and that's reactions to Kanye West's anti-Semitic statements in the autumn of 2022. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Kanye West and his statements. It was quite broadly reported in the press, also in the UK, of course. But just in case you haven't, a bit of background. So Kanye West is a US musician, rapper, music producer, but also fashion designer, an incredibly recognizable, influential figure in the entertainment industry, not just in the US, but also globally, with millions of fans, millions of followers, also on his social media. And before the autumn of last year, he had already made some far-right and anti-Semitic statements. For example, he expressed his admiration for Hitler, but it seems that those statements became more radical around October of last year, when he, in a few social media posts, he made direct references to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and tropes. And we have one example of that on the screen on the right there. That's a screenshot of his tweet from October of last year. I'm not going to read it out because, again, a lot of you might already be familiar with it, and it's just to illustrate kind of the intensity of those tweets, of those posts. For example, the first sentence of it is something that in our classification system that Matt talked about earlier, this is something we would classify as an anti-Semitic death wish. So quite a strong statement overall. And it was one of the few that he made at that time. I think it should perhaps be mentioned that Kanye West has been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and I wouldn't like to stigmatize someone's mental health condition. So perhaps this is a situation where we have to separate the person and his mental health from his words. However, the words are undoubtedly anti-Semitic, and we have been treating them as such, and we will see that they have been quite influential. They have triggered quite a lot of anti-Semitism in comment sections as well. So on the next slide, we've got some statistics to tell us a bit more about the analysis in numbers. For this case, we analyzed almost 4,000 comments. Half of that was for the UK, half for France. In the UK sample of that discourse, we found that 11% of the comments were anti-Semitic. In France, the number was slightly higher, 14%. But interestingly, the top 5 anti-Semitic comments, concepts, the most frequent concepts in those anti-Semitic comments were fairly similar. As you see on the graph, the proportion were just slightly different. So for the UK, the most common concept was taboo of criticism, and for France, Jewish power, although we'll talk about all of them in a moment with some examples. I should point out that, of course, one comment can contain more than one concept. That's why those percentages don't add up to around 100%. And we'll see examples of that as well. And I should also say all of the comments we'll show on screen have been anonymized but are authentic. So they have the original spelling, and we try to pick some that are representative of the type of comment we saw a lot. So they're not, unique in what they convey. And we have the first examples of that on the next slide, where we talk about the affirmation of anti-Semitism in West's statements. So perhaps the most straightforward type of comment we can find is just agreement. So very often we'd see comment that just said, yeah, I agree with him, or he's absolutely right, or I support him. And this is a very good example of a comment that outside of that context could have a completely different meaning. And this is something that we wouldn't be able to capture with quantitative analysis, as Matt was saying earlier. But if we see a comment agreeing with Kanye West's statements in the comment thread under an article directly reporting those statements, we in our classification, we have to classify it as anti-Semitic, contextually anti-Semitic, but still anti-Semitic, even though it doesn't reproduce any anti-Semitic stereotypes itself. It just affirms statements made by someone else. Sometimes those comments are a bit more elaborate, like the first example on screen that says they can't cancel him fast enough, he's speaking too much truth for them. Or the second one, they call him anti-Semitic, but they don't call him a liar. That theme of truth and truthfulness was quite a common one. And then some comments went a bit further and presented Kanye West not just as a sort of truth sayer, but elevated him to a status of a hero, of a sort of brave fighter for the truth, and called him directly a hero, or use some kind of other ways to do that, like in the last comment that calls him a misunderstood genius against the thought control. This is an interesting comment as well, because it seems to kind of conflate the admiration for his artistic achievement, artistic talent, or artistic genius perhaps, with support for his words. So it's almost as if it doesn't matter exactly what he says, but it matters who has said it. And because it's a person with huge following, and that person is possibly already a fan, they will also support that person, whatever he says. And that's something we have seen in previous cases sometimes too. Matt has already mentioned, for example, the David Miller case, who is also a public figure, not on the scale of Kanye West, but a well-known figure in the UK, in, for example, academic or sort of activist political circles. And similarly, he made statements that were reported as anti-Semitic, and that was quite a big story 2 years ago in the UK, and similar kind of similar following in his defense, spoke out in the comments. Again, not on the same scale, of course, in the UK context specifically, but we saw some of the same concepts. And one of those concepts we saw is the next slide, which is taboo of criticism. I already mentioned that was the top kind of comment, top anti-Semitic concept in the UK discourse for this case. Taboo of criticism is this idea that criticizing Jews is for some reason not allowed, that people who do it will be silenced. And some comments express it fairly directly, like the first example that says he was free to say whatever he wanted about George Floyd and whatever else, but the moment he mentioned Jewish people, he's cancelled. So fairly straightforward accusation. And also this comment explicitly mentions Jewish people, but that's not always the case. As Matt said before, there's a variety of strategies that people use to avoid saying Jews or Jewish people or Israel, and we see a few of them here. So in the second comment, the word that is used is Zionist, which we here know is not the same as Jews, but in the analysis we do, we very often see the word Zionist used as a stand-in for either Jews or Israel or both at the same time. The third comment simply uses J with 3 asterisks instead of Jews. And then the last comment is quite interesting too. It says, there are first-class citizens and there are those who are not permitted to look at them or talk about them. So this idea of a taboo is expressed at the end there in the second half, and not being permitted to talk about Jews allegedly. And then the first part of the comment it also contains this idea of privilege, of a privileged class of citizens, which is also an anti-Semitic stereotype in our classification. So we have a combination of those two here. And although those strategies appear all the time with almost any concept, anti-Semitic concept that we find, it's quite interesting here because it almost reinforces the idea of not being allowed to say something. So it's almost as if the speakers that avoid saying Jews, it's almost as if they were saying, well, as I've said, you are not allowed to speak directly of them, so that's why I'm saying it indirectly. So it's the linguistic strategy they choose almost reinforces the concept they are trying to promote in those comments. But as I've mentioned, we see these strategies in other concepts as well. For example, the next one on the next slide, which is Jewish power and influence. This is a very old anti-Semitic stereotype. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with examples of it from various places and periods in history. We see it a lot in the context of various events. Very often it's in the context of politics. In this case, it was mainly media and finance. However, actually in the examples on screen, they're even more general. So the first sentence says they control everything. The second talks about controlling humanity, and the last one about wanting to rule over everything. So very, very generalized statements. And each of the comments also talks about who is doing the controlling or the ruling. And again, those expressions are, those references, sorry, are indirect. So in the first one, we have they in triple brackets. Matt was talking about that earlier. We see that very often across all three languages we analyze. In the second one, we have a reference to the chosen people, which is a fairly transparent cultural reference. We would probably recognize that also outside of the context of this comment thread. So if we took this example out of this context, it would probably still be clear. But then the last one is a bit more idiosyncratic, and it talks about being crushed by the same juggernaut. So this idea of force, of power is conveyed here. And then also a single community. So this kind of separates, it creates that image of a community that in the context of this comment thread, we understand as Jewish community as being somehow separate. So Jews are also being othered by this comment. So again, a lot's going on here. And the idea of Jewish power and influence is quite closely linked to Jewish conspiracy, which we see next. So this idea on the next slide, this idea that that Jews allegedly not only hold like an inordinate amount of power, but also that they use it to instigate events from behind the scenes, and perhaps even trying to put Kanye West in danger. So the first comment again says it quite directly, although again the reference to Jews is implicit, a J in inverted commas, and it says the J don't like it when you call them out for controlling all the media and the banks. So again, the idea of Jewish power over media and finances. And then the second sentence also says they want everyone who isn't J to be fighting with each other, not knowing the reason for all their problems was started by the J. So it's pretty straightforward Jewish conspiracy expression. The second comment achieves that in a much shorter way, mentioning the word puppeteers. This idea of puppeteers, puppet masters is a very common verbal but also visual metaphor. Again, you might have seen, for example, in anti-Semitic propaganda posters from 1930s, 40s of last century, but it has sort of has been kept alive, unfortunately, in a very similar form also in comment sections. And then the last comment, I think is perhaps the most interesting here because it's the most innocuous on the surface. But if we break it down, it kind of reveals this, again, the idea of conspiracy. It starts with, it's about time people started raising awareness. So again, it's this idea that it's about time people like Kanye were telling the truth about what's happening, awareness about what they get up to. So again, they is implicit. We can only read it as Jews in the context of this conversation in this comment thread, they get up to. If you get up to something, that usually means it's something bad, something nefarious. And then so the masses can revolt against them. Masses tend to revolt against people in power. So when we put all that together, the image that is revealed by this, painted by this comment, is that there are people in power, implied as Jews, who have bad intentions, and people should know about this, but people are not aware of it. And then the last concept I want to talk about is actually two concepts, but they exist on the same spectrum, so to say. So it's denial of anti-Semitism or relativization of anti-Semitism. In other words, minimizing it, downplaying it. In this context, downplaying Kanye West's statements. And some of those comments were like the first one, where the commenter rhetorically asks, how is it anti-Semitic to point out that Jews control or have power in the media? So it reiterates this idea of power, but then says, well, it's a fact, so it's not anti-Semitic to point it out. So it denies anti-Semitism of such a statement. And then some of those comments sort of flip it, because they say, well, it's not Kanye West who's being anti-Semitic, it's other people who are being racist towards Kanye West. And before we analyze that last comment, of course, it should be said that Kanye West, as a person of color, especially a very public one, a very well-known one, I'm sure has suffered and racism probably before and after he became famous. Also, in our analysis, in comments countering anti-Semitism, we very often see other hate ideologies being weaponized. So, for example, racism or anti-Muslim sentiment or misogyny is often used to fight anti-Semitism, which is unfortunate. But we should also say that just pointing out someone's anti-Semitic statement is not racist, whether they're black or not. So of course, we, even with all that, we just focus on the situation. It's not a valid claim. And an example of that kind of comment is the second one on the screen. That says, look at all the white people in here complaining about a black man having an opinion about rich, corrupt Jewish businessmen. Racist AF. So having an opinion, anti-Semitism here is framed as having an opinion, which of course minimizes the seriousness of anti-Semitism. And then that opinion is about Jewish businessmen that again hints at that idea of alleged Jewish power in the business world. And it's framed as if as white people complaining about it, which is kind of again flipping that against other community and to the benefit of Kanye West. So that's it for this case. I'll pass you back on to Matt, but I'm looking forward to the questions later on.
Thank you. Sorry, Matt, just before you continue, can I just remind you that we're a bit short in time, so let's do it briefly for about 5 or 6 minutes. Thank you.
Sure, no problem. Okay, so the second discourse trigger we analysed in the discourse report were anti-Semitic incidents at the Qatar World Cup last year. And I don't know if you remember, Morocco did pretty well. I think they got to the semis, and often after their victories in the second round and the quarterfinals, the players brought Palestinian flags onto the pitch, and the Palestinian flag was quite central to their celebrations. We saw lots of Palestinian flags in the stadium, fans waving them a lot. It became a kind of theme throughout the World Cup. Outside the grounds, we saw the Palestinian flag over and over again. Alongside that, there were various incidents of Israeli journalists who'd gone to Qatar to report on the World Cup, being abused by fans, being screamed at, being shouted at, or being shunned, people walking off, people turning their backs on them. There were like 4 or 5, I think, separate incidents of that happening. And so these two elements were quite widely discussed on social media, and we focused on Twitter in particular, and we picked out 10, I think it was, tweets from various people with fairly big followings, journalists, commentators, And we tried to get a good range of them. So we got some tweets from people who were essentially celebrating the fact that, the Israeli journalists had been shunned or abused, or were kind of really, using the World Cup and the prominence of the Palestinian flag as a way of attack, as a kind of reason to attack Israel. But we also took some tweets from people who were pushing back against it and highlighting the attacks on the Israeli journalists and saying that these were incidents of anti-Semitism. Hang on, I don't know why that's not working. There we go. And so the results across all of those threads, again, it was around 10% of comments we classed as anti-Semitic, and I think it was true to say that actually we often found more anti-Semitism in responding to the people who were seeking to say someone to put a tweet saying that, well, I think this attack on an Israeli journalist is anti-Semitic. You would often find I'd find quite a lot of anti-Semitism in responding to that tweet, and often the same would apply the other way around. And so threads where the commentator was celebrating the attack on Israeli or whatever, you would get lots of people countering that and saying no, it was anti-Semitic. So I think there's that combative element of social media was quite apparent in these cases, I think. In terms of the most common concepts, number one was people denying Israel's right to exist, or denial of Jewish right to self-determination, as we class it, in various ways. Classic kind of the 3Ds: delegitimization, demonization, and I can't remember what the other one is, but I'm sure you all know. After that, there were lots and lots of apartheid analogies describing Israel as an apartheid state, which is I think overall must be one of the most common concepts that we see online and endlessly, because it's backed up by lots of kind of NGOs, third sector organizations who use that term explicitly. We do class in our analysis, we do class the apartheid analogy as a form of anti-Semitism. Matthias, Becker, and I and Carolina have written an article about this, which is being published soon. After the apartheid analogy, there were ideas of Jewish evil, and to code something as Jewish evil or Israel as evil, it has to be more than strong disapproval. It has to be, or even describing a particular incident as evil. It has to be a very generalized categorization that kind of essentializes Israel as essentially evil. Or the whole notion of a Jewish state as essentially evil, not just that the military have done something and that's classed as evil. That wouldn't count for us. We have quite a high threshold for what we class as an anti-Semitic form of an evil attribution, and that was third. And then the last one was deceit, which I find quite interesting. I'll talk about that in a minute. So yeah, we found frequent use of the apartheid analogy, and the apartheid analogy is often made very directly. It's rarely kind of covered up in implicit form. Occasionally it's made through allusions, just make vague references to South Africa or whatever, but often it's just Israel as an apartheid state. So you can see here, bloodthirsty apartheid state. Hitting the second one, apartheid analogy is combined with this concept of genocide, the accusation that Israel is committing genocide on the Palestinians, which is another very frequent idea that we see expressed. And that notion of Israel committing genocide, that is then connected to what we would class as kind of forms of Holocaust relativization, the idea that the situation in Gaza or the West Bank is anywhere comparable to Auschwitz or the Warsaw Ghetto or anything like that. I think that meaning is carried in a lot of those accusations of Israeli genocide. This idea of a Zionist echo chamber, and then at the end there's a direct comparison with the Nazis, modern day Nazis, but weaker, which is, I think that's an interesting qualification there. It can't even be proper Nazis. There's something contemptuous about that. And then we saw other comments that deny Israel's right to exist, or kind of call Israel's legitimacy into question. Zion-Nazi, not Zion-Nazi entity. It's not even a state. It's just an entity, which is essentially a reproduction or an extension of the Nazi regime. Israeli is a limited liability company, I think, and the idea that it's not a state, it's just run for business interests. It's about money. It's about greed. Not even a country. We see lots of these things. And often we get comments that just refuse to acknowledge that Israel even exists. It's not a country. It's not a real country. It's not a state. There is no Israel. We see quite a lot of that. So that was quite frequent in this corpus. This idea of Israel being kind of essentially evil, wholly, entirely evil of this kind of grand scale. So hatred of Israelis will come automatically if you're a human being. Any human being will look at Israel and hate it. And that if you don't hate Israel, then somehow you don't qualify as a human being. You don't have the kind of moral fiber or rationality of a human being. And so all is, by extension, all Israelis or Israeli supporters or anyone who just doesn't hate Israel does not qualify as a human being and is supporting evil, essentially. The next one: how do you defend killing thousands of children, butchering them in the streets, which is a kind of grossly exaggerated accusation. We're very careful when say there's been an incident when the Israeli military have killed a child or something. A comment that's talking about that very specifically would not necessarily be coded as anti-Semitic. They get coded as anti-Semitic when it turns into this huge kind of generalized thing where there's millions of children or thousands of children being killed and it's merciless, and that kind of thing we would code as anti-Semitic. And then again, you have Jews are worse than the Nazis, 21st century Holocaust. So there's a Nazi analogy. There's a comparison between Jews and Nazis. There's Holocaust relativization again. And then these last ones. Sorry, hang on. That they were responding directly to some of the ideas that the incidents where the Israeli journalists were kind of abused or kind of spat on or shunned, and people were saying that these incidents were not actually real, or that they'd been kind of instigated by the journalists themselves in order to get that response so that they could then complain about anti-Semitism. And that's connected to kind of ideas of Jewish kind of propensity for lying, for deceit, for instrumentalizing anti-Semitism that we see quite often. And I found that those ones they were fairly prevalent, and I found them quite very interesting in this context. Okay, so now I think I will hand over to Helena, and I'll stop sharing my screen, and then she can take over.
I think I was still muted, but I shouldn't be anymore. Okay. Can you actually see the slides? Because I can't right now. Just give me a second. I'll try once more. No, it doesn't really work.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Now I can see it.
But it's not the slideshow, right? So
it says towards the automatic detection of anti-Semitic discourse online.
But I guess you see all the other slides on the side. Or
yes.
Is it better now?
Yeah, that works.
Okay, brilliant.
You can't see it on your screen?
Sorry?
It's not on your screen, though.
So you don't see the full screen with one slide?
No, we do. It's good. It's good now.
Okay, brilliant. Right. So I probably don't have to motivate anymore why it could be useful to have tools that support an automatic detection of anti-Semitic content, and not only this detection, but also maybe a fine granular classification of what type of anti-Semitic content we actually read. Obviously, it's not only relevant for researchers, but also for NGOs who monitor the development on social media platforms out there that are confronted with loads of text, racist text, anti-Semitic text, hate speech, and so on a daily basis. Here we go. So when we talk about automated classification of text and automated detection of certain phenomena, then we are in the field of so-called text classification. And the general idea that we apply nowadays to build such models is to use so-called supervised machine learning approaches. So supervised basically means that we take an algorithm and we show the algorithm data from the past. So we show it texts, and we show it certain categories that those texts belong to in the opinion of experts who have annotated the text, like Matt and Carolina did, for instance. So basically the algorithms see data together with the corresponding labels, and we try to teach the algorithm to learn certain textual patterns in order to be able to predict on new texts what labels are the most probable ones. The tricky thing is that that type of algorithms needs a lot of label data in order to learn those textual patterns. And the more complex the textual phenomenon is, the more data you need, and the more challenging is the classification task itself. The way we do this nowadays, which is a lot better than a few years ago, is that we use so-called pre-trained large language models. So you might have heard of models like BERT or GPT-3 or GPT-4. So these are so what we have is language models that have been trained to solve certain general language tasks, like given a sequence of words to predict what's the most probable next word to follow in a sequence, which is also what we use in order to generate text. So we give like a starting sequence, and then it basically keeps generating word by word. And those general large language models, they have been trained with data from the internet. So basically you can think of like, taking almost the entire internet and feeding it into such models. So they have learned already a lot about general language structure. And what we have to do is we call it fine tuning. So we fine tune this language model in order to teach it what is specific about certain classes of text, like hate speech, anti-Semitic speech, and so on. So this is what we typically call downstream tasks. Now, there are a couple of challenges with text classification. So it sounds kind of nice and easy, and you can set it up technically in a standard way. But the real challenge with this type of text is that text from social and online media, they're often very short. You've seen like a lot of examples now in the previous slides. They're not only short, but they are fragmented. They use codes. You have a lot of references to person without naming them explicitly, references to certain named entities without naming them explicitly. There is a lot of broader background knowledge that is being utilized in order to formulate texts in order to be not discovered maybe by content moderation on platforms. So to avoid regulation, people use codes, but also to be well understood by peers coming from a similar group. So there is a lot of implicit statements that are being used in online and social media. Then we have references to other texts that might not be like the previous text in an online in an online comment section, but might have been the text that appeared a couple of steps before. So there are a lot of challenges that we face when we try to classify text from such sources. You kind of have to think about the fact that when you I think it's an interesting challenge for everybody. The next time when you go to social media and you look at the comments there, and you discover a comment that you find, I don't know, particularly abusive or interesting in whatever sense, you can try to find out how much information is actually formulated explicitly in this short piece of text. So, and we actually see that even humans struggle very often, even like experts struggle very often with producing highly consistent annotation for certain concepts, such as conspiracy theories, for instance, that are very often fragmented, or hate speech or anti-Semitic speech. Another issue that we are facing is that when we train models on certain types of data, for instance, we train it on data from Twitter, it might be that it doesn't really perform well on data from Telegram because the way language is used is different, or it might not perform very well if we apply it to, I don't know, we trained a model before COVID and then we apply it to text from COVID. It might be that it doesn't work very well because this domain transfer is not easy to solve. But I mean, there are approaches, but it's just an additional challenge. And moreover, while we have some research in this field on offensive and hateful language and toxic language, there is not yet so much research on specifically on anti-Semitic speech. So it is kind of new in this area. So we're kind of still at the beginning. One thing we wanted to explore as part of this project is to see whether existing commercial services that tackle related concepts actually perform well on anti-Semitic speech. There is one that is being used a lot in research, but also by content by media platforms like Reddit for content moderation, which is the so-called Perspective API. That has been developed by Jigsaw and a team from Google. And basically, this tool has certain so-called endpoints. So it computes different, you basically send a text to that tool and it produces scores for different concepts like toxicity, identity attack, threat, and so on. So basically the score is a number between 0 and 1, and I think it's normed by 1. And basically it, the higher the number, the more toxic, for instance, the text is, or the more, the higher is the level of identity attack, and so on. So for each of those concepts, you get a separate score for the text of interest. And this definition of toxicity has certain overlaps with certain forms of anti-Semitic speech. So they basically, in that service, they defined it in very broad terms and say that more or less toxic comments are those that might cause people leaving a discussion completely. So offensive, so that much offensive that people would actually leave the discussion. And identity attack is actually something that relates a lot more to attacking people due to the fact that they supposedly belong to a certain group. So what we wanted to see is how well actually that service can distinguish anti-Semitic speech from non-anti-Semitic speech. Because if it does well already, then that would be actually a positive sign, and we would know that, you know, organizations supplying this for content moderation do actually discover anti-Semitic speech and are able to mitigate it in a faster way. So what we saw is, now I don't see the numbers myself. So what we did is we took data from the project. We took 3,500 texts that were labeled as anti-Semitic and approximately 53,000 texts labeled as not anti-Semitic. And then we basically sent it to the service and evaluated the scores that came back. What we see in this graph, so you see like part of the plot, we wanted to see in particular, like, are the texts that were manually labeled as anti-Semitic, are they more toxic? Are they more severely toxic? So this is another attribute that they have where the providers claim that the severe toxicity is actually even more robust in terms of it's not triggered by insults so much. So this is also something that people tend to use in particular in research, and identity attack was the third attribute that we found is certainly very relevant and has a lot of overlap with the concept of anti-Semitism. So what we see in the graph is that the scores are higher always for the texts that were labeled as anti-Semitic. So you don't see a legend here, but basically the highest scores, so the orange bars, that's a text that were labeled as anti-Semitic, and the blue ones are those that were not labeled as, not anti-Semitic. And you see in particular a significant difference for the attribute of identity attack. So it shows that this service does pick up something that is contained in anti-Semitic text. So we cannot say for sure that it's the anti-Semitism that it picks up. So it could also be that one would have to explore that maybe in texts that were labeled as anti-Semitic, there is maybe also just more offensive language contained that triggers higher scores in this API. But at the same time, so we see that there is higher scores, but if we look at how high the scores actually are, then we see that they are not particularly high. So in research, people consider the threshold of 0.5, and many of them consider actually the threshold of 0.8 to be the relevant one. So everything with a score below 0.5, and in some cases basically even below 0.8, is not really considered toxic or severely toxic or whatever. And if we would take the threshold of 0.5, then basically 75% of all texts that the team had labeled as anti-Semitic would fall below this threshold. So we do see that those texts are rated in a different way by this service, but it would actually miss 75%, if not more, of all the texts that were found to be anti-Semitic. So from this, we actually already can conclude that it's not really useful for this case. And what we also did was to see, we tried to explore whether there is actually an influence by certain words, like words that are identity related, like Jew or Jewishness or Israel. So we basically did an exploration. I won't go too much into details, and I can leave that for the Q&A. But we basically looked at percentages of text that contain, so we looked at scores for texts that contain those identity related words. What we basically see is that if a text contains one of those identity-related words, then that the probability is a lot higher to obtain a higher score, which means that at the same time, we actually have a higher risk of so-called false positives, which is quite dangerous for content moderation as well, meaning people are talking about Jewishness, or people are talking about the state of Israel, and that would trigger, that can trigger, or it has a higher probability to trigger a high score in this service. And if the content moderation is automated in a certain way, then it might actually yield an automated exclusion of texts that actually just simply deal with this pattern, with this topic. Right, so starting from this, so basically realizing that that service is not going to help, and it's actually the main public commercial service available out there. We looked in the project how well it actually works to train a custom model in a way that I described a few slides before. So basically we take one of those pre-trained large language models that have learned a lot of statistical patterns about language from corpora like Wikipedia, Google News, and so on, and basically fine-tuning them with the label data from the project to distinguish anti-Semitic posts from not anti-Semitic posts. And we restricted for the start to English language posts only, and we only try to distinguish the posts on this ideation level, so just anti-Semitism versus not anti-Semitism. we explicitly excluded those contextual, so the posts that were labeled as contextually anti-Semitic, because as long as the model does not know what the text actually refers to, it actually has really little chance to detect the text itself as contextually anti-Semitic. We have some ideas of how to tackle this, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. What we also have as an issue is that we have highly imbalanced classes. So you've seen from the statistical evaluations before that Carolina presented that you have like around 10 to 15% of data that is being classified as anti-Semitic, and a lot more data that is being labeled as not anti-Semitic. And this is always a challenging thing for training models. So whenever you have that kind of imbalanced classes, the larger class is easier to learn than the smaller class. And if you basically, so there are like different approaches how to handle imbalanced data, but they are all kind of imperfect to just like give you an idea. So this is really a tricky thing to do. And one would actually really need probably need a lot more data belonging to the class of anti-Semitic texts. So we did this type of fine-tuning on different types of language models. And sorry, I think my computer is in need of battery. Matt, could you maybe share your screen? And I'm just gonna grab my power supply. Would that be okay? Okay, just give me a second. I'm back in 10 seconds. I'm sorry, apologies.
I think we should play some music or something. Or maybe not. There we go.
Sorry about that. Okay, maybe you can, do you want to continue sharing your screen? That would be great. I think I was one before such. Right, exactly. So, so you can actually jump to the next one. So we basically, there are like different types of those large language models, and there are different parameters one can play around with before we start training, in fact. So we did, and the current model that we have, so keep in mind, we just took like the data from the English corpus, and we only restricted to those posts that were considered only on their own could be labeled as anti-Semitic, and those that considered on their own could securely be labeled as not anti-Semitic. And so here, what you see, if you look at the second last column, the number of records, this shows you the performance on the so-called validation set and the test set. So this is like kind of data sets that you put to the side in order to evaluate your model. And so you see that we have like almost 10 times as many data in this so-called class 0, consisting of non-anti-Semitic texts. And the scores for that class are a lot better than for the other class. So which means that the model we have trained can very securely see that a text is not anti-Semitic, but it has a lot of trouble. So a lot of trouble in quotation marks. So we should consider this actually in relative terms. It does find, in this case, it would miss 35% of anti-Semitic posts, but at the same time, it would have a very low false alarm. So we would have to see like what consequences this would have in practice, because one thing that members from the team have discovered is that anti-Semitic posts come in bundles. So when we have like a discussion in a news forum, then typically when we have like one anti-Semitic post, then there are, in a reaction to this post, there will be more anti-Semitic posts. So it can well be that we are very well able, even with this model, to discover almost all of those concentrations of anti-Semitic sub-discussions. So this is, I think, something that will be interesting to explore. So this model currently would have a very low false alarm, but it wouldn't find not nearly all of the anti-Semitic texts that we have in the corpus. One can actually move these thresholds, so I can make this so-called recall higher and make sure that we actually detect more of anti-Semitic texts. But at the same time, in the current performance, it would actually mean that the false alarm would also be higher. So this moment, basically, like I can like shift the two errors against each other. But it's also the question, like if you think about content moderation, how many false alarms are you actually willing to work with? So it can actually be actually quite good to have a score of like 70% recognition, because if you're a content moderator and you actually want to see like what's going on in a certain discussion, then that actually might be completely sufficient for a person to know, okay, this is something I should look into in more detail and see what's going on. But these are actually initial results, so we have not trained the model on, and you can maybe go to the next slide, and this is the things that we are working on right now. So we are basically feeding the model with more data, and we are quite confident that it will get significantly better when it sees more data. There is more data in the English corpus, but also there is data from the other corpora, like the French and the German one. And there are like different approaches how to handle multilingual data. There are multilingual language models. We can also work with automated translation. And this is something we will explore. We will, at the same time, not only work on the further development of models, but actually spend some time in evaluating our current models, so to see how well do they work in domain adaptation. So we will basically run them on new discourses and see how they perform there. And we are trying to understand the current ones in more details in terms of what are actually the so-called difficult positives. So what's the text that has been labeled as anti-Semitic, but the models are struggling a lot to detect them as such. And I think this is something that is also very valuable insight for the annotators, because they can actually see what kind of language patterns are actually tricky for the current language models in terms of interpretation. Of course, right now there is the whole discourse around GPT-based chat models and GPT-based models in general. So ChatGPT is known by probably everyone here. And there is current research looking at possibilities of fine-tuning those models. We are currently working on that as well. So we are confident that we'll have results on this towards the next and final discourse report. So that's our current lines of research, and I think I'll stop here and give over to Carolina and Matt.
Thanks, Helena, and thank you everyone for bearing with us. Very quickly, to sum up, also what we're working on now will make its way into a few publications. So first of all, the 6th discourse report at the start of next year, where we'll talk more about the ongoing qualitative analysis, but also the detection models. And then Matt already mentioned the lexicon, which is almost ready. And we're also starting to work on autology. And we are also preparing a series of online workshops to sum up our thoughts gathered in the course of the project. And we've invited other experts to talk about their research and compare and exchange on our experiences. Details on that will be on our website soon, as well as all the reports and all the other information. So please feel free to have a look. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. And I think we're ready for the questions now.
Yes, so we have a few questions now. And since we're a bit short in time, I will read some of them and I will summarize basically and group them together. So a few questions. Few people asked about the topic of distinction between anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel, and comments addressing the Palestinian issue. So how does your model identify anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, anti-Israeli sentiments, purely pro-Palestinian sentiments that are not anti-Semitic, and so on?
I'll take this one quickly. So we start from the IRA definition, which we essentially take as saying that it is possible for discourse around Israel to be anti-Semitic. IRA does not say that all discourse around Israel is anti-Semitic. So therefore, it becomes the task of distinguishing the two. We definitely don't label anything that kind of talks about the Palestinian situation or particular events or automatically as anti-Semitic. We're very careful to try and look at different ways in which it can be expressed, and one of the main kind of distinctions is one I mentioned earlier, which is this notion of generalization or essentialization. So if you're criticizing a particular incident, you're criticizing something that has some kind of concrete basis, that there is an event has happened, or there's a particular political faction in Israel or whatever, or a particular event, something that's happened in the West Bank or Gaza. If there's a concrete basis to that criticism, then we would look at it carefully, but it would by no means automatically be coded as anti-Semitic. If, however, a particular incident is kind of presented in a completely exaggerated, hugely exaggerated, essentializing way, so that incident becomes a manifestation of some kind of inherent Israeli evil or Jewish evil, or it is used to kind of say that Israel has no right to exist at all as a state, then, or that Israel is just deliberately targeting children and hospitals endlessly because of some kind of inherent drive to want to kill as many people as possible, that kind of thing, we would then code as anti-Semitic. Concepts like the apartheid analogy are, they're controversial, right? They're controversial within the field of anti-Semitism studies. That essentially the apartheid analogy and BDS is the main difference between IRA, although IRA doesn't actually mention either of those things, but IRA and the Jerusalem Declaration on anti-Semitism. Okay, but that's the main distinction, and we, through our analysis, and we kind of do take a position on that, in which we would code apartheid analogy as anti-Semitic, and we can make a big argument about why we think it is. That the term was used long before Israel even came into existence. It's been used, Israel has been compared with apartheid long before 1967. But methodologically, there's no actual reason. You could use the same method of qualitative analysis of data, followed by quantitative, AI use, without necessarily relying on that particular concept. So if there was a huge controversy about it, that doesn't delegitimize the project as a whole. But in general, we're extremely careful about making the distinction between the two, because it's hugely important that space of legitimate criticism of Israel is held open in the same way as legitimate criticism of any other state is held open.
Great, thank you. Another set of questions are more logistical, I think. So can you, and I'm reading the questions, can you does it matter if somebody has a flow of comments? So maybe a prolific writer will comment again and again and again on the same post, maybe either himself or through various accounts. Does it matter? And the second section of this question is, will you be able to detect where they are coming from, the comments? And thirdly, which is another logistical question, do you take into account other languages?
Maybe I'll try to take those three. So I think perhaps I can start with something that we haven't really talked about a lot earlier. When we analyze a comment, we might see who posted it, but we don't focus on people's identity. We don't look into who they are, how many followers they have, or where they're from, even though sometimes, of course, we could make some assumption. And that, of course, makes things more complicated because yes, they could be bots, they could be from perhaps from a different background to others, and then our assumptions about, for example, what we call the UK discourse or the French or German discourse are then slightly blurred. But our overarching aim is to, in the project, is to, or one of the aims is to reflect what this discourse looks like, even with those influences. So, for example, the fact that UK comment sections are often can be an international place of debate. That's part of the nature of this discourse. It also varies from event to event, because, for example, again, in the case of David Miller mentioned before, perhaps that was of interest more to British people, and that debate that was going on there about the party politics of the UK with very specific country-specific references will probably be not visited by a lot of people, a lot of readers of UK outlets from other countries. But to answer it briefly, no, we don't look at the identity of people. If we see a comment that appears sort of suspiciously often, and we think that might, for example, it's an anti-Semitic comment, and we think that it will affect our numbers, we take it into account only once. That happened a few times, that someone, either a bot or a very patient person, posted the same thing again and again. We then don't take it into account each time, because on the whole, as Matt already hinted, we try to annotate conservatively. So whenever we have a doubt, we prefer to not to count something as anti-Semitic.
Great, thank you. And we have another interesting question. I think it will be one of the last questions because we're just short of time. And the question is, how did you analyze toxicity and less toxic and less toxicity, and give it points, whether use a software for analysis like sentiment analysis? Kindly explain. And they referencing slide number 36.
I can check which one that is, but I guess it refers to the slide on Perspective API. So the scores were not produced by us. We used this service called Perspective API, which is a service meant to support content moderation in online media. So basically, it's a service where you send, you send there a text. So a machine sends a text and gets an automated response consisting of scores for those specific concepts like toxicity, identity attacks, severe toxicity, and so on. And we did that with the corpus, basically, so with a part of the corpus. We took data from different languages, German, French, English, those labeled as anti-Semitic, those labeled as not anti-Semitic, and basically analyzed the scores we got back from the service. Figuring out that basically the largest part of the content that has been labeled anti-Semitic would not pass a threshold, which is considered a threshold, which is considered a relevant threshold in practice. I hope that explains the slide.
Thank you. I think it's about time to wrap up. So any last comments or notes from the speakers? And if not, I think we'll say good night and good evening.
Perhaps just that, yeah, we are very sorry that we are running out of time, but please feel free to get in touch with us via the website. Have a look at the publications. Hopefully they will clarify some of the things we haven't been able to do in person.
Thank you. David, do you want to close this session?
I will very formally. I thought that was a really, really interesting session, really interesting project, really impressive presentations. Thank you very, very much.